This is House Planning Help episode 180. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up today, it's a solo session as we look at where to live during your build. Before we get stuck in, I haven't said this for a while, but is there something that you would like me to cover on the podcast? Because we can do this. Maybe you're facing a challenge and you could do with some fresh inputs, or perhaps you just think there's a topic that would really make sense in the series of podcasts that we're making. We love hearing the questions. I think we've got a pretty good success rate. I'm guessing around about 80 to 90% of the questions you ask, we manage to answer. And the ones that we don't, they're still on the system. We still look at them from time to time and think, how would we answer that? Or who would be the right expert? And then if someone does pop up to be able to answer it, that's where I think, right, here's our chance. But often the questions that we don't get to are highly specialized on a very specific technical detail, which I just think, I can't even grasp what the question is, let alone how we'd start to answer it. So if you'd like to submit a question, you can always just head to the website, houseplanninghelp.com/contact. Let's get to today's topic of where to live during your house build. And on the surface, it's straightforward, isn't it? Having gone through it, though, I wonder whether there are actually more factors at play than we realise. If you could sit down and work it all through, I'm sure you would realise them. But it's taken this experience to just make me think, well, there's an episode here, and it's the right time, really, for me to share it. So let's go into this. And I imagine there will be people who perhaps romanticize the saving money side of things. I'll camp on the sites and save as much money. And then in some way or other, that decision turns out to be not so good. So don't rush in here. As ever, with many of the decisions that we make on our projects, this is really about money. So if money isn't an issue, it's quite possible this is a good episode to skip through today. You don't need this one, because the ultimate situation would really be, and this is our first option, staying where you are. Just save yourself all the disruption, just stay put, and then you can just move from one situation to the other. I've just gone through this move, and as much as I felt in a good place to do it, things could have been a lot worse. As I mentioned, my wife is heavily pregnant, so the baby could have come at any time, but luckily did not. Baby could come at any time, maybe even as I'm recording this podcast today. But you've just got all sorts of little jobs. None of them are difficult, but they all take time. And I remember thinking, well, I'm not going to schedule in any work for the moving week because it will feel good to get work done. If I do it the reverse way round, where I schedule a little bit of work and then can't get to it, I'll be really upset. And in actual fact, I had no chance of doing any work. In fact, when I moved into the house, they said, oh, don't worry, the internet will be ready to go. You just plug in and it will be fine. Remembering I run an internet business, plugged it in, didn't work. Things like that they're not major, but they get to you, particularly when you're piled up with boxes and I can't even get to the fridge to have something to eat. So it doesn't take a long time to unpack these boxes, but it does take time. So this is all disruption. These are the pros, really. You're avoiding the disruption. You should be in somewhere that's reasonably comfortable, presuming in a lot of cases, if you can afford it, this might be a property that you own. The downside, we've mentioned it, it's expensive. Also, it might not be near to your plot. And this is a very important point that may even lead you, even if you own your property and can afford it, to moving closer to where you're going to build, particularly if that is miles and miles away. Thought it was worth mentioning our hub case study, Buckinghamshire Passive House, because it's not exactly along these lines, but interesting. They bought a piece of land with a house on it that they thought they were going to do up. It was a retrofit project. And as they got into the detail and started looking at how we do this, they discovered the building was in such a poor state. It wasn't in a great position on the site either. And so they decided, let's make it a self-build project. And part of the planning agreement was, well, you can keep the existing house, but as soon as the new house has been constructed, you have to demolish the existing house. So they've got where they're able to stay for the duration of the project, and then they'll have to fulfill that as soon as they move into the new property. Now, before we look at some of the other options, let's review what's important here, because it's that striking a balance, isn't it? It's about not spending too much money so it can go into the house build, and also making sure you're as comfortable as you want to be. For each of us, that's going to be different, and there are factors to consider. So I'll just run through some that have come to my mind. For example, if I was doing this by myself, I may well pick the riskier option of going on site, constructing a hut or whatever it might be. However, when you're doing this as a family, that completely changed the mindset of what is important. And really, a lot of this going through a build, I just want it to be a good experience if it possibly can be. So consider who's involved here. Also, what are your needs? Do you need to be close to a school? Do you need to be close to work? Do you need to be close to the plot? It's going to vary for each of you. For me, do you need to be close to high-speed internet? What is your mental attitude like? Are you someone who needs all the luxuries, or do you go out camping every weekend? And if you do go out camping every weekend, could you therefore save a bit of money by moving into a smaller space, downsizing for a while, storing equipment? Or do you think that even though you love camping, it would eventually get to you? How long will you be living there? And this is difficult to answer, of course. For me, moving into the rental property, I hope it's around about a year. But do you know what? I have no idea. We haven't got our planning permission yet, so that is a big factor. So consider best and worst case scenario. And I think the worst case scenario for us would be that we were here for 2 years. I mean, it's a possibility. It could be 5 years. You just don't know, do you? But in that situation, could you visualize yourself being relatively happy in the property that you choose? And I think a further step here is just to imagine the weather, on that worst day. Let's say it's been a really bad day on site. It's cold, it's raining, and then you go back to this accommodation. How does it make you feel then? And that's where we move on to what I think is the second option, which is the one that I've selected. I think a lot of people do. Moving into rented accommodation. One of the key pros is that you get to choose your location, and I imagine you'll want to be just that bit closer to your piece of land. Maybe it's striking a balance between that and work and schools and anything else that you've got to do. But that was certainly a factor in my own case. We'll come to that. I'll use myself as a case study in a few moments. Also, I think this route, renting a property, actually minimises disruption. Yes, you've got an extra move involved. You've got to pack up the house, unpack, maybe store some items. But it's not too bad. The key thing is when you're building, you can close the gates on the site, walk away and have something that resembles a house and hopefully doesn't have anything that looks like a construction site anywhere near to it. So you've got relative comfort. Perhaps it's not as nice as your old home and certainly not as nice as the new home you intend to live in and that you're building. On the downside, money is going out on a monthly basis, and money will continue to go out on a monthly basis until you can get into your house. So if there are any delays on your project, then this is something to factor in. As I mentioned, you do have 2 moves, and there is the stress and strain that comes with that. You can obviously pay people to help you with the move, but this episode is very much about where that balance is. What are you going to pay for versus what are you going to save? Here's a factor that's quite interesting. It's maybe not as homely when you rent because you have to sign a contract that says anything, even putting up pictures on the wall, you have to contact the landlord and check that's okay. I've lived next door to people who rent and seen numerous situations where they totally ignore all this, or they get pets in when it's a no pets property. And that's not how we intend to be in our rental property. When we arrived in this one, actually, we looked round before they painted it. It looks fantastic now, but before they painted it, the previous people that were renting here had done murals on the wall and all sorts. They'd laid a carpet where there were some tiles, and the landlord, I think, was really worried that they'd smashed all the tiles underneath and were covering it up. So, yeah, you've got this downside that perhaps it's not as much of a home as you would like. But, of course, you've got your possessions there. You're there as a family, and if you've chosen well, hopefully relative peace away from your site. So I just thought it'd be worth going into a few details of how we looked at it, because you've also got to think when you're renting, there's a range of money, isn't there? It's not just one price. And we looked at probably 1,100 a month to 1,700 a month. Don't get worried by the numbers or anything. This will vary hugely according to where you are in the world. This is just where I am, which is fairly close to London. So at the higher end, that was perhaps over the top. That would have been wasting money, but we saw one property that was right at that high end that was about a 2-minute walk, perhaps a bit longer, 3-minute walk from the plot, but far enough away not to be able to see it. And we liked that, and we thought we could maybe negotiate down to 1,500, which would have been fair. The downside would have been at that point that my son, one of the things that we're trying to keep stable is to keep him at the nursery. So with all this change and having a baby sister soon, there are a couple of things that are exactly the same. So we would have been driving backwards and forwards to this nursery. But of course, at some point, we're going to be living in our house and having to address this. So that was the upper end. The lower end, I think, as low as we got, as I mentioned, was 1,100. It would have been a squeeze in those sorts of properties. I think what you get as you go further up the scale is just more space, sometimes more storage as well, guaranteed parking. So you just have to think it through. The one we went for was around about 1,300 a month. It's not perfect, but what I really liked about it was it's close to my son's nursery. And whereas a round trip might have taken 20 minutes to half an hour, depending on whether you're driving or walking, this one, if you're walking, take about 10 minutes. If you're driving, take about 2 or 3 minutes. So that's a big time saving over the year that we're here. It's also on the right side of town. We actually looked at a couple in various locations and we're always working out what will it be to go to the plot. And being on the other side of town would have meant having to get through the traffic. If you ever do it between 3 and 7 in the evening, there's a lot of traffic. So we're right on the edge of town, and that means we know 10 minutes, unless something very, very weird is happening, we can get there consistently to the site. You also have the layouts. Every house is different, and for me, one of the important things was this room at the back of the house where I'm recording this now. I thought I need somewhere that's quiet to record. A lot of the properties just didn't seem to have that. They were on a corner, or it's difficult because I look at it obviously from a very unusual perspective. Not everyone needs this, but I just need that insulation of sound really, so that whatever's happening out the back, always just keep an eye on, and no dogs next door or anything like that. They start yapping in the middle of the podcast. So all of those sorts of things, you'll have your own criteria that you'll go through too. I'll tell you one of the funny ones about this property, and that's the garden. We had a garden on 3 levels before, which was very pretty garden, a paved area at the far end on the highest level. My son did pretty well there, never had any major accidents, although you'd always have your eyes on him. Well, this one is much smaller, and it's more of a square. And so, because it leads out of the kitchen, I can be doing some cooking in the kitchen and see what he's doing in the garden. So he's in that area and he can go around on his little scooter backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. He absolutely loves it. And I do enjoy that when I discover different things living in different areas. Obviously, my last house, we've been there for nearly 13 years. So you forget pros and cons of different places where you live. One of the drawbacks, we're located on this route out of town, although it's a plus as well as a minus. Sometimes it's noisy. Generally, it's motorbikes accelerating. So if I didn't sleep with earplugs, there's no way I'd be able to have the windows open at night time. We're a little bit further away from the key amenities in town, although to my surprise, in some ways it's probably safer to cycle into town from here because there's more of a cycle lane. You're right beside the busy road, so if any vehicle swerves towards you, you've no chance. But yeah, the actual cycling seems to be quite good paths to get back to the centre of town, so we've done that a few times already. And another weird thing is that being in this rental property, if we'd got that one close to our plot, then it would have been a lot easier to transition my son to the school that we ultimately want him to be in. But because we're further away, we just can't do that. So we have to wait until we've moved to be able to apply to that school. And one final point here, this is just me, is having that small galley kitchen. Every house will have a different layout. And I suppose we might have a little bit more space, but I don't think that much. And so the floor area here, I would say, very, very similar. It's just how the space is different. And one of the concessions is this smaller kitchen. And you know I like cooking, so I really don't like kitchens where people just walk straight through them, which is what this one is. And it's got one hob that doesn't work. We'll try and get that fixed. What else about it? I'll cope. I will cope. No dishwasher. That was it. No dishwasher. Let's look at our third option. And this is to move in with family or friends. Upside here, really good way to save money if you have nice friends or family who say, yeah, we're not going to charge you a penny. You just bring in some food or cook for us. Also, you should be in a good level of comfort, because I'm imagining if you're going down this route, it's going to be a house that can handle it. Don't move in with family or friends if you think the house is not large enough that you can at least get a little bit of peace. The downside is it's not your space. You're always on best behaviour, and you're not going to have that personal space other than perhaps your bedroom. Maybe it's going to be a long distance to your building site. Again, you're going to have to move twice. You're probably going to consider some storage unless this person has a ridiculously large house. And this is a key one too. If it goes wrong, it could break down a valuable relationship. Not many people would think of letting you into their house for a whole year. It will have to be someone that you're really, really close to. I suppose you could jump from person to person. That would be a lot of packing up though. You have to be someone who doesn't have many possessions. So my own situation, we did consider this. My parents openly said, look, come and stay with us. We'd love to have you all there, which is fantastic to have that offer. And that for me is one of the benefits. I love spending time with my parents and would really have enjoyed that. Saving money, yes. Additional childcare, yes. The drawbacks though, in this situation, they live about an hour and a half away from where we are now. So that's quite a journey back to our piece of land, and even further away to get to our architect. The other thing I mentioned, that there's a lot of change in my son's life at the moment, and this would disrupt his nursery. He just wouldn't be able to go there anymore. Of course, I've mentioned my parents would be great as additional childcare, and no doubt we could find somewhere that he could go locally near to where they live. However, I also know my wife needs her own space and really enjoys seeing her friends regularly. And I think that moving that distance away would really not be good. And if there's one relationship that I would not like to jeopardize ever, it would be that relationship with my parents, because they've been hugely supportive. So I think this moving in with family and friends, it might be good in theory. You've just got to be supremely confident, haven't you? And I suppose it could work for a section. Say, for example, we were prepared to do 2 moves. You could save some money by moving in with those friends just before you get to the build. So I could store all my stuff very close to where we live, move down there for a few months, and then come back when the actual construction was underway. I still think it's a step too far for us. Hopefully that's given you a few insights there. And then finally, stay on the site. We've all seen it on grand designs before, and generally it doesn't seem to go too well. There are various options though, and one of them, which perhaps is more common these days if you are someone who's been through the planning process and this is allowed, is to actually sort out your outbuildings first. So maybe it's an office that you've got permission for, or a lavish garage block, or whatever it might be, somewhere that you can make a home that would actually feel pretty sturdy. You know what the spec of the building is, and again, that will allow you to save money, because it's such a weird feeling to have invested money in a piece of land. When I think of what that money could be doing in terms of buying other rental properties, and then it's just sitting on a piece of land. So you probably would want to get out onto your land and be using that once the outbuilding is in place. The other key factor is that it allows you to keep an eye on the work that's going on, which of course is a double-edged sword, isn't it? So we'll come to that in a second. Varying levels of comfort and space. This might be a downside. It could be a little bit primitive, certainly when it comes to space, or if this building wasn't kitted out to have people to stay in it for a long time, so you're just cutting right back to the basics. Also, you can't get away from the sight and the noise so much. At 8 o'clock every morning or whatever time the team arrives on site, that's when you're definitely going to be up and moving about. And also, if there are problems on the site, it's harder to turn your back on it. Perhaps this may be hazardous for kids as well, if you've got a family to think about. I know the site will be closed up, so it shouldn't be hazardous from that respect. But knowing how inquisitive my son is, he'd find something to fall down or something to fiddle with that he shouldn't be. And I guess these are the pros and cons really for the other options too, which is caravan or a static home. And you don't necessarily have to buy these. You can rent them. Perhaps you're going around a home building show and you might see them demoing one there that you can have a look around, but they go very big or very small depending on your needs. If you do buy one, sometimes there can be a good market to pass these things on, and then again you're cutting down on your costs. There's a little bit of risk built into that. The final option really is a mobile home or camper van. And again, you can rent or buy these. Maybe it's something you might already have, a camper van. You do need to consider whether you can do it this way. I think this is hardcore. In fact, I must, if I ever come across someone who's had great success in one of these last options and really enjoyed it, I will interview them, because I think that would just be so interesting to hear what type of person they are. Two more things to mention. One of them is storage. Don't forget about this, particularly if you're building a nice big dream home. There's lots of space in it. Your old home had lots of space too, and then you're now downsizing in between, because you're going to need either a garage, perhaps some boarded out attic space as extra storage, or maybe even you're going to have to rent one of those units. There are lots of them around. It's amazing. They're not that cheap. We looked into that as an option. Granny and Gramps, my parents, have been sent home with a few boxes. We put some in our attic space here. We don't have a garage for this rental property, so that was one downside. But again, we were just balancing it all out. The thing that we do have on our site, we have a shipping container. So as long as it's not books, that's actually a really useful storage area. When should you move? This comes down to when you're going to need that money and your attitude to risk, because selling a house is not, I'll tell you what, I'll sell the house and then the next day it's gone. There are all sorts of factors at play. Maybe you're in a chain and the chain breaks down, or maybe, like in my situation, you're perhaps worried about certain things, the impact of Brexit. So far, nothing has happened at all, but I wonder whether the UK market might crash, and I still think that's a possibility. In my situation too, it took about 5 months to complete, and that's quite quick for England. Maybe you're listening elsewhere in the world and thinking that is ridiculous, but there were no chain. It was a first-time buyer, so other than a couple of niggles, it was a very smooth process. And the reason we did all of this is because we wanted to get started as soon as possible, and just having the money there ready to go means you're not going to be slowed down from that respect. However, a lot of that comes back to the planning application, and we have heard recently that we haven't had our planning application approved. I'd love to go into more detail here, but we've got an extension to try and work through some of the feedback that we've got from the planners. So fingers crossed we can do that within the 4-week extension. Otherwise, there's going to be a much longer delay. So that's again something you're gambling with here. And just one final thing to mention. Mike Coe, we interviewed him in episode 152. I'll put that into the show notes as well. And it took him over a year to sell his house. Now, this was a really good quality house. Just bear all of those factors in mind when you come to think about when you should move, because it is, again, tricky getting it 100% right. Well, that's everything that I've got to say on today's episode. I hope you found that interesting. You can add your own thoughts at houseplanninghelp.com/180, which is also where you can review all the main information. Let's finish up on a couple of iTunes reviews. We do this every so often, and this comes from Toby Coke in the UK. Title is Great Series, Very Engaging. Great series of podcasts recording Ben's rapid learning. Rapid? Really? In the house building sector, with a strong emphasis on self-build, sustainable construction, and a fantastic range of industry experts contributing. There's also a subscription service available for active self-builders needing more support and knowledge-sharing opportunities. Please keep it up, Ben, and best of luck with your new house project. Thank you, Toby. This one is from Coxie4321 in Australia. Ben has put together a comprehensive collection of podcasts on sustainable building. Highly recommend subscribing, whether you're in the game or having passing interest. The podcasts are very professional and the guests are at the pinnacle of their field, and Ben has an easygoing nature about him when interviewing his guests, and the topics flow seamlessly. It's also thoroughly supported by a detailed website. Thank you, Ben. Please don't stop. Really appreciate your reviews. The other thing is that it does bring in newcomers. When you write a review, it flags us up in whatever directory. Those were iTunes reviews, but perhaps you're listening via Stitcher or some other app. Write us a review. They'll all have different methods of rating us, and it would be much appreciated. Thank you so much for listening today. Catch up with you next time. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.